Every economy operates under a basic mathematical tension. Public goods require funding, but taxes remove resources from the private sector. The heavier the tax burden, the more the scale tips against private investment. For decades, macroeconomists have navigated this tension using a specific theoretical model. It is known as the Armey Curve, named after economist Richard Armey. This chart shows the theory. It plots economic growth on the vertical axis against government spending as a share of GDP on the horizontal axis, forming a smooth, inverted U parabola. The model proposes three distinct phases. First, a rising phase, where basic infrastructure boosts productivity. Then, a declining phase, where excessive spending crowds out private enterprise. Between them sits the peak. That peak represents the hypothetical optimal size of government. The theory suggests maximizing a nation's growth requires calibrating state spending to sit in this sweet spot, traditionally estimated between 20 to 30% of GDP. This single geometric assumption has guided global fiscal policy for a generation, operating under the belief that functional governments eventually find an optimal middle ground. Testing this theory requires looking past textbook diagrams. Pulling cross-country averages from the World Bank's database provides a structural sample of 151 modern economies. This scatterplot shows the actual distribution of these nations on the exact same axes. The neat parabola disappears. Instead, we see a heavy cluster of low-growth countries on the right and a sparse group of high-growth countries on the top left. If we force a quadratic regression onto this data to find that empirical sweet spot, the math fails. Letting the data dictate the shape contorts the curve into a U-shape, placing the theoretical optimum completely outside the observed range. The statistical fit for the traditional Armey curve yields an R² of exactly 0. In cross-country macroeconomics, an R² of 0 means the model possesses no explanatory power. Statistically, the theory is no more accurate than simply predicting that every country will grow at the global average. This suggests the macroeconomic sweet spot might be a mathematical artifact rather than a real-world destination. If the Armey curve cannot explain this distribution, we need a model that can. To find that model, we have to look closely at the high-spending side of the dataset. This region is dominated by mature European welfare states, spending 35 to 45% of their GDP. When we zoom in and apply both the quadratic curve and a simple linear decline model, the trend lines project sharply downward, eventually crossing straight through the zero-growth baseline as spending increases. This creates a boundary condition failure. The math forces these models into impossible territory, predicting a permanent annual contraction between -5 and -8%. In economic terms, these models predict that nations like France or Sweden should be suffering through Great Depression-level economic collapses every single year. But that isn't what happens. The actual data points for these countries show them hovering in a horizontal cluster just above the zero line, maintaining a sluggish but positive growth rate of 0.5 to 1.5%. Any valid model must account for this resilience. Large welfare states in the real world stagnate. They do not collapse into oblivion. There is a mathematical model that aligns with this distribution, the power law. When we run this curve through the global scatterplot, it successfully traces the trajectory of the 151 countries in the sample. This fit provides an R² of 0.24, alongside a low AIC score of 162. While no single variable explains everything, explaining nearly a quarter of all cross-country growth variance is a strong result in macroeconomics. The geometry of the power law reveals how spending actually correlates with growth. First, we see a steep, immediate drop on the left. This indicates that government spending is associated with reduced growth even at low levels. As spending rises, the curve flattens into an asymptotic tail. It maps the trajectory of high-spending nations, reflecting their stagnation without dipping into the impossible negative numbers predicted by the older models. This shape aligns with the reality of crowding out. A heavily taxed economy loses its dynamism, but established institutions and market momentum prevent a total grind to a halt. The power law shows no evidence of a beneficial rising phase. Instead, the data suggests that government spending acts as a diminishing marginal harm to growth. This brings us to the primary objection of endogeneity. Do large governments actually slow growth, Or do wealthy countries simply buy larger welfare states because they can afford the luxury? To find the causal direction, we have to look at natural experiments where nations dramatically changed their fiscal policy under pressure. This dual chart tracks Ireland and Sweden between the late 1980s and the year 2000. In both cases, these nations slashed their total government spending as a share of GDP. These cuts were not a response to prosperity. They were initiated at the exact moments these nations were suffering through severe fiscal crises and deep recessions. When we overlay their GDP growth, the pattern is clear. Growth accelerated and remained high, with the spikes occurring 1 to 3 years directly after the spending cuts began. This chronological sequence, austerity adopted during a crisis preceding a growth recovery, suggests that the spending levels were the driver, not the result of the economic shift. But this still leaves the Nordic paradox. If large governments correlate with lower growth, why are countries like Denmark and Sweden among the wealthiest on Earth? The answer lies in the difference between a stock, which is accumulated wealth, and a flow, which is the current rate of growth. This bar chart shows the Nordic wealth stock. These nations steadily accumulated their wealth over a century of industrialization, built during eras when their governments were significantly smaller than they are today. But their modern growth flow tells a different story. Between 2005 and 2019, while their welfare states consumed roughly half of their GDP, their growth was stagnant, averaging just 1% annually. When we map these current coordinates back onto the power law curve, we see exactly where they fit. The Nordics do not break the model, they confirm it. By sitting on the low-growth asymptotic tail, their current performance matches exactly what the power law predicts for high-spending economies. Across 151 countries and nearly 2 decades of structural data, the pattern remains consistent. Aggregate government spending correlates with a downward trajectory in growth. If state spending reliably slows economic activity, then the most effective use of that power is as a targeted brake rather than a generalized engine. There are specific areas where an economic brake is useful. We must slow down activities where private actors externalize costs onto society, whether through pollution, the depletion of shared resources, or systemic financial risk. However, most modern spending is not targeted at these externalities. Broad redistribution and sprawling bureaucracies apply that braking force indiscriminately, suppressing productive growth along with the harmful activities. Relying on the Armey Curve framework creates a hidden cost. When policymakers use a flawed model to justify larger budgets, even small systematic underestimates of the drag on growth compound into massive losses in prosperity over time. Understanding the power law is the first step toward reclaiming the growth potential that the Armey Curve's sweet spot has been hiding for decades.